Good afternoon. In addition to the PowerPoint and the information in the back of your books, you also have the department manual. This is a manual we put together both for staff and each of the preserve operators each year. It's just kind of something for you to reference throughout the year, and it's updated again every year. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of what private shooting preserves are in South Dakota. So to get started, we'll start with some general information on preserves. In 1963, the South Dakota legislature enacted the Private Shooting Preserve Act that authorized the issuance of permits for shooting preserves. A shooting preserve is defined by law as an acreage of land either privately owned or leased in which pen-raised game is released for the purpose of hunting for a fee. So basically, it's a commercial upland bird hunting operation that's permitted by the Department of Game, Fish, and Parks. Preserves can be issued, or preserve permits can be issued for either 1 or 3 years to any South Dakota resident, corporation, co-partnership, or association. The corporations and co-partnerships must be registered and be current with the Secretary of State's office. According to state law, the land involved in new shooting preserves cannot be located within 1 mile of publicly owned land managed for wildlife and hunting without prior public notice and department approval. The private shooting preserve fee for an annual permit is $100 plus an additional 40 cents for each acre of land within the preserve. The 3-year permit fee is $300 with an additional $1.20 or $1.20 for each acre within the preserve. So basically, with the 3-year permit, you're paying for the 3 years up front. Game birds that can be licensed on a South Dakota preserve include pheasants, quail, partridge, and in some cases, turkeys. So what is a preserve? A preserve is a continuous acreage of land, meaning the land must be connected either by touching at corners, sides, or across the road. Preserves have to be at least 160 acres and can be no larger than 2,560 acres. The preserve permittees must either own or have a controlling lease on all preserve acres that they enroll. And finally, a preserve permittee is allowed 2 preserves if the acreage of either preserve does not exceed 1,280 acres. As I mentioned before, the preserves got their start back in 1963, and during the first 20 years or so, there was never more than 2 preserves at any given time. In the 80s, preserve numbers really started to take off, and you can see on the graph that in the 80s and 90s, the preserve acres across the state were at a steady increase. To a certain extent, they started to level off in the early 2000s. And on the graph, it looks like in 2005, we took a hit in preserve numbers, which is actually a little deceiving. That year, there was a rule change that allowed operators to increase their preserve size. So as a result, operators combined small preserves into one larger preserve. So as a result, we lost preserve numbers, but we actually gained in preserve acreage. You can also see in the graph that in 2010, 2011, preserve numbers again took a big hit. Preserve operators were not immune to the recession, and a fair number of the operators decided to get out of the business. However, recently, preserve numbers have started to level off again. So here we have the total number of preserves over the last 10 years. And as you can see, we hit a high in 2008 of 229 preserves. For the last 4 years, we've hovered around that 200 mark. And this year, we'll have 197 preserves permitted. So this map shows where preserves are distributed across the state for this upcoming 2014-15 preserve season. Region 1 has the least amount of preserves, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there just is a naturally lower wild population out there. Region 2 by far has the most preserves, and that kind of has always been the case. This year in Region 2 we'll have 121 preserves. A lot of the preserves are located along the counties that are along the river. Historically, Gregory County has had the most preserves than anywhere else in the state, and at one time they had as many as 33 preserves. In recent years, Brule County has become a hotspot. Brule County is now tied with Gregory for the title of most preserves in the state, both of them which will have 20 this year. Region 3 and Region 4 also have their fair of preserves. Region 3 has 41 preserves permitted for the upcoming season, and Region 4 has 29. Both regions continue to increase their numbers each year. So here we have, for the 2014-15 private shooting preserve season, we will have 197 preserves involving 166 different permittees. The total land involved in preserves for the upcoming season is 194,885 acres, which is actually down from last year about 4,400 acres. The average preserve size for this upcoming year is 989 acres, which is up slightly from last year's average of 968 acres. So here we kind of have the harvest information for the last 10 years for preserves. During the 13-14 season, preserve permittees released over 400,000 rooster pheasants across the state of South Dakota. The pheasant harvest total for the 2014 season was up from the previous year by about 22,000 birds. 260,426 roosters were harvested on preserves across the state. The percentage of marked, or rather released pheasants harvested on a preserve was again up from the previous year. 90%, or just over 234,000 released roosters were harvested on preserves, whereas just 10%, or over 25,000 wild roosters were harvested on preserves. Historically, these percentages are closer to an 80-20% range. However, a lot of the permittees, along with everybody else in South Dakota, had a harder time finding wild birds last year.
Mr. Chairman, if you want to take questions. Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that previous slide, where you've got the 2013-14, you got 90% and then 10%, which is the total birds that were harvested. Why do you not include the percent of released birds harvested in a column? You released 434 and they only harvested 260. Should you not put a percentage there?
We certainly could do that. I was just following the
previous year. That's fine.
I
don't have a calculator, so what was the percentage, if somebody got a calculator, of the birds harvested versus released?
It's probably around 50%.
54 is what I came. Thank you.
So could you tell me, how do you determine what a released bird is? Turn on your mic, Gary. Oh, could you tell me how do you determine what a released bird is versus a wild bird? What markings are there, or how do you determine that?
I will. I can tell you now, and
Tell
we're
me in a
also,
minute?
yep.
All right, sorry.
So basically, a released bird is one that a permittee is required to release. It's a pen-raised bird, and it has a marking either by a toe clipped or an enlarged nares. So basically, a hole through their nose. Something that's visible, physically visible, to be able to see after the bird's harvest.
And then the reporting that gets done, sorry.
Go ahead.
The reporting that gets done to get to those numbers, are those all accounting, if you will, that are done by the preserve owner?
Yeah, they're required on their daily records to record all harvested birds, both marked and wild. They have to differentiate if they're marked or if they're a wild bird.
If I might. The reason I asked the question, I think last month there was some discussion about the percent of harvested bird or released birds harvested. That's why I posed the question. Thank you.
All right. So these next three slides are going to focus on the key preserve rules and regulations. They're just kind of an overview of the regulations. Obviously, they do go more into depth. First off, the preserve season is like an extended 7-month season that starts September 1st and goes to March 31st. There are many different licenses valid on a shooting preserve. Clients can either use a small game license or a shooting preserve license. A shooting preserve license allows the client to take only those species listed on each individual preserve permit. Shooting time,
Can you just mention what the cost of that shooting preserve license?
I believe it's, the annual one is the same as the small game license. There's also a 5-day and a 1-day license, and offhand, I don't know how much they are, but they are in the book. Let me see. Rules and regulations.
There's a page in there. You should look at.
Is it? Okay.
46, 76, and 121 for non-residents. So the annual is 121 for non-residents according to the book.
Yeah, it was recently changed, so there's no difference between the small game license, the non-resident small game license.
But the other one, the 5-day, like 46? 76. 76. Okay, thanks.
Nope, that's fine. Okay, so let's see. Shooting times on a preserve are from sunup to sundown. There is no possession limit on a preserve. Preserve permittees are required to maintain and record their records at the end of each hunting day. And preserve permittees are required to notify their local conservation officer on all bird releases. Let's see. Department approval is needed for preserves that are within 1 mile of an area managed for public hunting. Preserve records have to be open to inspection at any time by a department employee. Both wild and released birds harvested on a preserve acres must be tagged with a department-issued kill tag. Birds must be released on preserve acres prior to hunting. The minimum release requirement of 300 birds goes into effect for the first year of operation on a preserve. After that, it's 600 birds for each season, each season going forward. Only rooster pheasants released from August 1st to the end of the preserve season, which is March 31st, can count towards the minimum release requirement on a preserve. The maximum daily bag limit on any shooting preserve is 20 male Chinese ringneck pheasants from the beginning of the preserve season through the end of the statewide season. From the end of the statewide season through the end of the shooting preserve season, the maximum daily bag limit is dropped down to 15 roosters. The daily bag limit for partridge and bobwhite quail is unlimited, and turkeys have a 2-bird daily limit of either sex. The combined harvest of released and wild birds cannot exceed 100% of each species that has been released. So in other words, they can't shoot more than they release. All birds released on a preserve, with the exception of chuck or partridge, must be marked by either having a toe clipping or having enlarged and rounded nares, which were the holes through the beak. All untagged birds held in possession or in storage are considered as wild birds, and the state daily limit and possession limit do apply. So now we can look at some of the historical changes to the daily limits on preserves. The first daily limit was set by the commission back in 1986. The commission set the daily bag limit at 8 roosters per day, except in Harding, Butte, Lawrence, Meade, Pennington, and Fall River counties. These 6 counties had a daily bag limit set at 15 roosters or hen pheasants outside of the regular season and 15 roosters during the regular state season. The maximum daily limit for turkeys was set at 2. 10 years later, the daily bag limit for pheasants on shooting preserve was changed to a maximum of 15 birds, or 15 roosters, except for the 6 counties in Region 1. In those counties, they still could shoot 15 hen or roosters outside of the state season, and then 15 roosters during the state season. In 1999, Fall River County was removed from the 6 counties that had the exception to the daily limit. In 2006, the maximum daily limit was changed to 15 roosters statewide. The exception for the 5 counties in Region 1 was removed. And then in 2009 marked the last change in the daily limits. The maximum daily limit was set at 20 rooster pheasants from the beginning of the hunting season through the end of the statewide season. And then from the end of the statewide pheasant season through the end of the private shooting preserve season, the limit returned to 15. So we can also look at some of the other notable changes in rules and laws of the preserve laws that have happened over the years. And we can start with Codified Law 4110-7, which is the issuance of a permit, which also includes preserve boundaries in relation to public hunting areas. When the Private Shooting Preserve Act was authorized in 1963, preserves were required to be at least 5 miles away from each other. In 1986, the legislature reduced that distance from 5 miles to 3 miles. Also in 1986, the legislature added a provision that preserves were no longer allowed to be within 1 mile of a public shooting area without department approval. And finally, in 1996, preserves were allowed to border each other. So then we can move on to the historical changes concerning kill tag fees. In 1967, the legislature required kill tags for the first time. In 1975, a 10-cent fee for each kill tag used on a preserve was established. That 10-cent fee was repealed in 1982. In 1984, a 5-cent fee was reestablished for all kill tags used on birds harvested on a preserve. In 1990, the commission set a $2 fee for each unused kill tag that was not returned to the department at the end of the preserve season. And then finally in 2009, the kill tag fee was changed from 5 cents per kill tag to 25 cents per kill tag. Next, we have the changes to the minimum release requirements on preserves. In 1967, a minimum release of 500 pheasants was established. In 1976, the commission lowered the minimum release to 200 pheasants. In 1996, the minimum release was raised again to 300 pheasants for all new preserves and 600 pheasants for all renewing preserves. And then finally, in 2006, the release of hen pheasants was no longer counted towards the minimum release in Harding, Butte, Lawrence, Meade, and Pennington counties. And finally, we have the changes that in the administrative rule concerning the maximum harvest percentages. In 1967, the commission approved a rule that stated at no time during the preserve season may a permittee harvest more than 80% of the number of marked birds that they had released. In 1986, wild birds were included into the total. The rule change stated that wild birds harvested, in addition to marked birds harvested, could not exceed 80% of the number of birds released. And then finally in 2001, that rule was amended so that at no time during the preserve season may a permittee's combined harvest of marked and wild birds exceed 100% of the number of birds that they had already released. And that's the end. So, any questions?
You have a lot of the information in the back of your book, although Janelle was able to summarize many of these categories and put it into that format, which I appreciate. Thank you very much for your work. Any other concerns or questions? Emmett, do you have anything to add? Go ahead, Gary.
The maximum that can be taken, whether it's 15 or 20, is that released birds or released birds and wild birds, or?
It's a combination of both. So it can be all released birds, it can be all marked birds, or it can be a combination of it.
Or it could be all wild birds?
It could be all wild birds, yeah.
And the marking that's done, the toe clip or the beak, is that sufficient to allow a hunter to figure out when a bird flushes whether that's a released bird or a wild bird?
No, it would be after they've harvested that they could identify it.
I know there's been some discussion about, and I'm sure we'll get into it, about what the laws are in other states. Do you know, I know it wasn't part of your presentation, but you probably know. We, is it South Dakota and Hawaii that have the limits on the number of birds that can be taken, and all the other states don't have a limit? Is that accurate?
I don't know.
You know, I don't know specifically, you know, in our state, you know, we're somewhat unique in the fact that we have a large wild pheasant population. And so, you know, the regulations here are probably akin to comparing apples to oranges with regard to some of the other states. So probably we wouldn't be a fair assessment, you know, between the two.
What I'm curious about, because I've also heard, and I don't know if it's true, is that other states where they perhaps don't have limits also don't allow wild birds to be taken, and that there's a way that you mark released versus wild so the hunter can figure that out, and you leave the wild birds out of the equation. So I'm wondering, is that the way it is in other states, do you know, or?
I don't know. You know, probably one of the only obvious ways that you could do that would be to streamer the birds with some kind of a streamer tape. You know, we do make that provision and have an allowance for sportsmen to use pen-raised birds on training dogs. They can attach a streamer to the bird's leg, and the bird flushes, and they can shoot the bird. They see the streamer. It's just a long piece of survey tape, basically, is what it is. That's attached to the bird's leg. To me, that would be the only way you could, you know, specifically determine if a bird was released, you know, on site. Again, the toe clip and the Nares mark, you have to have the bird in hand to make that distinguishing difference between a wild bird and a pen-released bird.
Well, so one of the concerns, I think, is if we go to 30 limit or an unlimited limit, what is there to protect the number of wild birds so that we don't get into shooting an unlimited number of wild birds?
You know, I guess, and I probably allow the industry folks to respond to that. They'd probably be the best people to address that. In the situation where we allow wild birds to be harvested, you know, all year long there is always a chance for a wild bird to be harvested on a shooting preserve. In most cases, the operator wouldn't be able to sustain a commercially viable business if he didn't release birds. They may be able to harvest wild birds, depending upon the quality of their habitat, for 1, 2, maybe 3 weeks. But after that, it's going to be very difficult for them to sustain the kind of harvest that would, you know, provide an enjoyable experience to most of their customers. So they need to supplement their releases. And in most cases, they do that, and of course they're required to do that from day one. But you know, a lot of those wild birds become pretty wary to the gun, and you know, aren't as available. Now, it's not to say they don't shoot wild birds during the entire course of the season that an individual preserve may have, but you know, a lot of them are very wary, as wild birds are. They get used to a car door slamming, and they're running out the other end of the habitat before the hunters can even jump in there. So, you know, there's you know, the industry folks are probably the best to address, you know, the way they see that. But that's been I think our staff's experience with the preserved birds. Certainly they're going to harvest wild birds. There's no question about that. But they are required to release birds in, you know, sufficient numbers to essentially ensure that, you know, they aren't just going to harvest all wild birds. To sustain their business, they need to release birds.
I did have a process question too.
Go right ahead.
Given all the history that there is to the regulation, along the way and through the years, are there various groups or associations that have sat down, come together and figured out, well, we think this is a fair way to do things and let's do it this way and we'll all look at it this way and give a little bit and we'll have some balance? I assume that's what's happened along the way.
And I think both Janelle and I probably could address that. Over time, we have had the shooting preserve industry group formulate, you know, a board and have membership, and we have worked with those groups over the years in that kind of a negotiation process and a discussion. Of late, they haven't had a very active group. The group has kind of fallen apart, at least it's my understanding. But again, they kind of come and go, and you know, I think over the years we have had historically some pretty good discussions and dialogue with those groups. In fact, have agreed to compromise, you know, and coming forward to the commission with some rule changes and even statutory changes that were the result of some of those discussions. It really makes it a lot nicer for our staff and in the department, really, to have a group like that to meet with and have, you know, a group that really represents the interests of the industry broadly. And so I would encourage and would really appreciate, I think the department would, having a group who does represent the broad spectrum of interest in the industry. Of late, in the last at least 4 or 5, maybe more years than that, we've not had that opportunity. And I think the group has just, you know, sort of fallen by the wayside, as those interest groups do oftentimes. So
I might be able to, go ahead, Barry. Well, let me just add real quick to what Emma was saying. I can speak from the standpoint of the period of time from 1995 until 2007 when I was the secretary. And during that period of time, one of the first things I did in 1995 was go down to a meeting in Chamberlain where the Preserve Shooting Association was holding a meeting to take a look at some of the changes that they would like to have seen, both at the administrative level, the rule change rail, and at the statutory level. And one of the things that we discussed was the importance of the series of compromises that go into trying to set before a board, either at the legislature or at the commission, and trying to explain what it is we would see together that would make sense in terms of this rule change, a proposed rule change. So there was lots of close cooperation at both the regional levels and at the state level, the game fish and parks, in terms of trying to figure out there's lots of controversy, as we all know, but to try to figure out what would be the best path forward, and to have as many win-win situations as we could. You're not going to have them all, but you certainly can get close if you spend the time and the effort. So I wanted to let you know that that was a real effort in terms of the Game Fish and Park staff while I was there. That's about the best anecdote I can give you for that, Gary. Barry, did you have?
Thank you. Quite a little to get your hands around here in a short time. On the fee end of it, the preserve operator is charged $100 fee, and then, what'd you say, 40 cents or 50 cents?
That's the application fee. To submit an application, that's the fee.
And then each bird that is shot is a quarter?
Correct.
And who pays that?
The operator.
And then he in turn would charge the shooter, the hunter, whatever, I guess, probably, huh?
Yeah, most of them do pass that on to their clients.
They usually charge by the day, is that how it's?
Most of them have package deals. I mean, everybody's different, but most of them have package deals.
And then if they were to shoot more birds,
They charge accordingly.
that'd be increased.
Correct.
Okay. All right, that's that. Then, I think, just glanced at the numbers, but there was 400,000 raised?
400,000 released birds, but they only
Released.
pay for the ones they actually harvest.
Okay. And then out of those, they shot about 60%, 60%. And then those wild birds, or those tame birds go in, or raised birds go into the habitat. Are they marked so that you can, like next year, you would know whether you shot a raised?
Without going and aging the pheasant, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was one that was released this year or last year, but you should still be able to tell if it's a
Should
marked
still
bird,
be
yeah.
marked, yeah. So then when they turn in their report, is the number of wild birds and the number of raised birds separated out?
Yes, on their daily guest register, which is a record, which you have a example in your
Okay.
book of, they are supposed to, by group, not by individual, but by group, record how many wild pheasants and how many marked or released pheasants are harvested each day for each group.
What's that run? Does that, I mean, on an average, would it be 85% raised, 15%, or
Historically, it's like an 80-20 ratio.
20?
20% are wild, 80% are the released. Last year was a little different. Last year it was a 90-10 ratio.
Oh, yeah. And those raised birds can reproduce and everything just like a wild pheasant?
They should. I don't know how many actually make
Yeah.
it to the end of the year with predators and that kind of thing. If they're kind of, they're not the most intelligent birds after
Right.
they're released.
Of course, the one thing you want to keep in mind is the birds that are released are roosters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they won't breed and have young, but they certainly could fertilize a wild hen, but
Okay, all right.
Go
Thank
ahead,
you.
Gary.
I was just gonna follow up on the financial part of it. So the $100 permit fee and the 40 cents per acre and the 25 cents per bird, does that basically take care of the department cost of oversight and whatever, or does it generate any extra money that is used for conservation or that sort of thing?
at our last calculation, and it's been a couple of years, my recollection is it really met the administrative costs that we had for, essentially the Janelle's salary, and we also have a shooting preserve inspector that goes around and visits the preserves and looks at records. Of course, our conservation officers are out there monitoring releases, working with the preserves. They actually go out and of course, make contact with the hunters and to assure that they're properly licensed and are abiding by all the other regulations. So our last assessment was that was pretty much of a balanced cost and outlay. They were in balance.
Which is probably why those numbers have been arrived at through the years, working with everybody and trying again to find the balance of what the right thing to do is.
Right. And of course, the preserves themselves, when they release those birds, there's a large cost in the individual birds. My understanding is birds are $14, $15 or more a piece to be, the birds that are released at 15 weeks of age. So essentially, they're adult birds that they purchase from a bird supplier that raises those birds, generally from small chicks up to the adult size, and then a lot of them contract with individual bird raisers, but I think the industry folks could probably tell you better what their costs were, but the last I understood was $15, $16 was pretty close to the average cost per bird.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly back to whether that release bird would be alive yet the next year. There is some studies out there that, you know, the lifespan of a wild bird is not very long. I would assume a release bird would be less. Do you have any numbers on that? I would doubt if many of those release birds would make it to the next season. Personally, I don't know, but is there any statistics on that, Emmett or Janelle?
We do have, and I know Tony, as a wildlife biologist, had actually done some research on that, and we've had other staff research that, and there've been a number of papers over the years. Generally, the idea is that those wild pen release birds just are not as capable as a wild bird to survive, and of course they aren't accustomed to predators, and you know, when they're raised, obviously they're raised in an environment where they can have ready access to food and water and so forth, and it is their survival is considerably less, probably a fraction of what wild bird survival is.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Very well done. Appreciate that. We're going to entertain one portion of the open forum. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes to have one person